Bali is an island that has never been shy about its spiritual life. Temples rise from rice terraces, offerings line every doorstep, and the line between the sacred and the everyday has always been deliberately thin here. But even by Balinese standards, what waits at the bottom of the Pakarisan River Valley is something different, something older, something that stops you before you fully understand why. To reach Gunung Kawi, you descend. That is the first thing to understand about this place. You leave the road, leave the noise, and walk down nearly 300 stone steps cut into the hillside, passing through a towering split gate that frames the valley below, like a painting someone forgot to finish. The air changes as you go lower, cooler, heavier, with the smell of moss and river water. By the time you reach the bottom, the modern world feels genuinely far away. What greets you there are 10 enormous shrines carved directly into the face of a volcanic cliff. Not built against the rock, not assembled from cut blocks, carved into it. Each shrine stands roughly 23 feet tall, a towering niche cut deep into the stone, and inside each niche is a form that represents a royal memorial tower, what the Balinese call a kandi. The cliff itself became the building material, the scaffold, and the monument all at once. They were created in the 11th century, most likely during the reign of King Udayana or his son Anak Wungsu, one of the most powerful rulers in Balinese history. The shrines are believed to honor members of the royal family, the king, his queens, and possibly his concubines, though the exact identities have never been confirmed with certainty. An inscription at the site, written in an early form of Balinese script, is one of the oldest ever found on the island, and even that offers only partial answers. What the inscription cannot explain is the sheer scale of the decision to carve these memorials the way they did. The builders had choices. They could have constructed freestanding temples, as was common across the Hindu-Buddhist world of that era. Instead, they chose to go into the mountain, to let the rock itself become the vessel for royal memory. That is not a practical decision. That is a philosophical one. Across the river from the main group of 5 shrines stands a smaller cluster of 4, and slightly apart from those, a lone 10th shrine associated with the king's chief minister. The spatial arrangement was intentional. Even in death, hierarchy was preserved. The king and his queens faced each other across flowing water, the river acting as a kind of eternal boundary between the royal chambers. The surrounding complex grew over centuries. Monks once lived in the small chambers cut into the rock face above the shrines. A working temple still operates at the site today, tended by priests who maintain rituals that connect the living community to the royal ancestors honored in the stone. This is not a dead archaeological site. It is an active one. Incense burns, flowers are placed, and the old relationship between the human and the divine continues in the same valley where it began nearly 1,000 years ago. What makes Gunung Kawi genuinely hard to absorb is the combination of its age and its completeness. Many ancient sites survive as fragments, a foundation here, a broken column there. The shrines at Gunung Kawi are largely intact. The carved niches still hold their shape with remarkable precision. The proportions, the symmetry, the deliberate placement against the vertical cliff, all of it reads clearly, even today. You do not have to imagine what this place looked like. You can simply look. There is something in that permanence worth sitting with. A king in 11th century Bali made a decision to be remembered not in a building that could be dismantled or relocated, but in the living rock of a river valley. He chose the mountain itself as his monument. The mountain obliged, and 1,000 years later, the river still runs, the stone still holds, and the shrines still watch the water pass, patient in a way that only stone can be. From the carved cliffs of Bali, we move now to a coastline shaped not by human hands, but by forces so violent and so ancient that the result looks almost impossibly like it was designed. Where Gunung Kawi speaks to the human impulse to impose order on stone, the north coast of Ireland presents something that flips that idea entirely. Stone that imposed its own order on itself, and did it so precisely that people refused to believe nature was responsible. The Giant's Causeway sits on the northeastern tip of Northern Ireland, where the North Atlantic arrives without apology. The wind here is constant. The sea is cold and grey more often than not, and the basalt cliffs that line this stretch of coast have been absorbing the impact of that ocean for longer than our species has existed. But what draws people to this particular half-mile of shoreline are not the cliffs. It is what lies at their base, roughly 40,000 interlocking columns of basalt, most of them hexagonal, fitted together with a geometric regularity that genuinely challenges your instinct about what nature is capable of. The columns range from a few inches across to nearly 18 inches in diameter. Some rise only a foot or two above the waterline. Others stack to heights of nearly 40 feet. Seen from above, the tops of the columns form a surface that looks almost like a tiled floor, one that leads from the base of the cliffs directly into the sea, disappearing beneath the waves toward the Scottish coast some 80 miles away. The geology behind this is well understood today, though no less remarkable for the explanation. Roughly 60 million years ago, during a period of intense volcanic activity along what is now the North Atlantic margin, lava poured out across this landscape in massive flows. As each flow cooled slowly and evenly from the top and bottom surfaces, it contracted. That contraction created internal stress fractures that propagated in regular patterns, and the most efficient geometric solution to that kind of uniform stress, as it turns out, is the hexagon. The same pattern appears in dried mud flats, in the eyes of insects, in the structure of honeycombs. Nature, given the right conditions, keeps returning to the same shape. But for most of human history, that explanation was not available. What people saw instead was a road, a causeway, built by something that was not human. Irish mythology gave that something a name. Fionn mac Cumhaill, the giant warrior of legend, said to have constructed the causeway as a path to Scotland so he could confront a rival across the water. The Scottish side of the story has its own version, its own giant, its own outcome. The details differ depending on who is telling it. What the stories share is the certainty that no ordinary process could have produced what they were looking at. That instinct to reach for myth when the physical world exceeds expectation is not ignorance. It is a very human response to genuine wonder. And standing at the edge of the causeway, with the Atlantic swells rolling in and the columns wet and gleaming under a low sky, the mythological explanation still has a pull that pure geology cannot entirely displace. The site was formally recognized by the scientific community in the late 18th century, when debate between geologists over its volcanic origins played out in the pages of scholarly journals and drew visitors from across Europe who wanted to see the evidence for themselves. It was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1986, one of only two in Northern Ireland. The other is the nearby Causeway Coast itself, which frames the columns within a landscape of dramatic sea cliffs, hidden bays, and ruins of its own, including the remains of Dunluce Castle, perched on a separate basalt stack, as if daring the sea to take it. What lingers about the giant's causeway is not any single view or any particular column. It is the cumulative effect of the place, the repetition of that hexagonal form across such a wide expanse of coastline, the sound of the sea working at the rock, the sense that you are standing at an edge in more than one sense of the word. The land ends here. The geometry ends here. And 60 million years of geological time press up quietly against the soles of your shoes. The giants, if they existed, built well. And if they did not, well, 60 million years of volcanic cooling managed to produce something that still makes the myth feel entirely reasonable. The Atlantic coast of Ireland and the highland valleys of southern Colombia share nothing obvious, not climate, not culture, not geography. But both places carry the same quiet insistence that something significant happened here, and that the people responsible for it understood scale in a way that still commands attention. We leave the cold basalt shore behind and travel to a warmer kind of ancient, where the stone is not volcanic geometry, but carved human form. Hundreds of them, scattered across a mountain landscape that has been holding its secrets for more than 2,000 years. San Agustín sits in the Colombian department of Huila, high in the Andes, where the Magdalena River begins its long journey north to the Caribbean. The elevation here runs between 5,000 and 6,000 feet, and the landscape is one of deep green valleys, steep ravines, and a persistent mist that moves through the hills in the mornings, like something with its own intentions. It is the kind of terrain that feels private, folded in on itself, protective of what it contains. What it contains is the largest collection of pre-Columbian funerary monuments in the Americas. More than 500 stone statues have been found across an area of roughly 200 square miles, most of them associated with burial mounds that date from approximately the 1st century through the 8th century of the Common Era. The civilization that created them has no confirmed name. They left no written language, no clear successor culture, and no oral tradition that has survived intact to carry their story forward. What they left are the statues, and the statues are extraordinary. The figures range from under a foot tall to nearly 14 feet in height. Some are realistic in their proportions, depicting human forms with careful attention to posture and expression. Others are something else entirely. Hybrid creatures combining human features with the attributes of jaguars, serpents, and birds in ways that suggest a cosmology where the boundaries between the human and the animal world were not fixed. Many show extended fangs, wide-set eyes, and clawed hands. These are not decorative choices. They are theological ones. The statues were placed deliberately in relation to the burial mounds they guarded. Some stand in front of the mounds like sentinels. Others were positioned inside small stone chambers called hypogea, which were built directly beneath the burial earthworks, essentially underground temples, some of them lined with carved reliefs and painted in red and black pigments that have survived in sheltered spaces for over a millennium. The care given to these underground chambers suggests that the builders understood the burial site not merely as a place to deposit the dead, but as a threshold, a carefully constructed point of passage between one state of existence and another. The social complexity implied by all of this is significant. Organizing the quarrying, carving, and transport of hundreds of large stone figures across mountainous terrain requires a population with surplus resources, specialist labor, and sustained political organization over generations. Yet the culture that accomplished it remains stubbornly anonymous. Archaeology has revealed the what, and to a degree, the how, but the who and the why exist mostly in inference and interpretation. What is known is that this was not a single event or a single reign. The statuary tradition at San Agustín developed and evolved over roughly 7 centuries, with different artistic styles evident in different periods. Early figures tend toward abstraction. Later ones show increasing sophistication in their rendering of the human form. There was continuity here, and there was change, the signatures of a living culture working out its relationship to death and the divine over a very long stretch of time. UNESCO designated San Agustín a World Heritage Site in 1995, recognizing it as an irreplaceable record of a civilization that has no other monument to its existence. The park today protects the most concentrated groupings of statues, including the Mesitas, a series of flat-topped hills where burial mounds and their guardian figures are clustered in numbers that give a real sense of how densely this landscape was once occupied by the ritual life of its people. Walking among the statues in the morning mist, with the Andes rising on all sides and the sound of the Magdalena somewhere below in the valley, the anonymity of the builders does not feel like a loss so much as an invitation. They did not sign their work with names. They signed it with stone, with form, with intention, with a seriousness about the passage between life and death that speaks clearly across 2,000 years of silence. The unnamed builders of San Agustín left their civilization encoded in stone figures, guardians placed at the threshold between the living and the dead, their identities dissolved into the mist of the Colombian highlands. As we move from that green anonymity into the stark clarity of the Arabian Peninsula, we encounter something different, a civilization that very much wanted to be known, that traded across continents, that carved its name into the rock faces of a desert valley, and that history somehow managed to overlook for centuries anyway. The Dadan kingdom occupied a narrow oasis valley in what is now the Al-Ula region of northwestern Saudi Arabia, roughly 1,000 miles north of Mecca. The valley sits between sandstone cliffs of deep red and amber, and the contrast between the arid terrain above and the fertile floor below is still striking. Water from underground sources made this strip of land habitable and, more importantly, commercially viable. In the ancient world, viability meant traffic, and traffic meant power. Dadan was a major political and commercial center from at least the 9th century BCE, reaching its height somewhere between the 7th and the 4th centuries BCE before giving way, gradually, to the Lehionite kingdom that succeeded it and occupied the same valley. At its peak, Dadan controlled a stretch of the incense trade route that connected the frankincense and myrrh, producing regions of southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa to the markets of Egypt, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. Frankincense was not a luxury in the ancient world. It was a necessity. Temples burned it by the ton. Palaces required it. Medicine used it. The trade in aromatic resins was, for several centuries, one of the most economically significant commercial networks in the ancient Near East, and Dadan sat squarely on its path. The physical remains of the kingdom reflect that prosperity. Archaeologists working the site have uncovered evidence of a densely built urban center, stone foundations of structures that suggest a city organized with the kind of deliberate planning that comes from sustained wealth and administrative capacity. There are temples, storage facilities, and residential areas. Inscriptions in the Dadanite script, a South Semitic alphabet distinct from both Arabic and Hebrew, have been found carved into rock faces and on votive objects, recording names, dedications, and transactions that give the civilization a textual presence even where the structures themselves have eroded. Among the most visually dramatic remnants are the rock-cut tombs carved into the sandstone cliffs above the valley floor. These burial chambers were cut with precision into the cliff face at varying heights, some accessible only by cut footholds in the rock. The facades of the more elaborate tombs show carved details, niches, symbolic reliefs that reflect both the wealth of the individuals interred and the theological framework that governed how the Dardanites understood death and whatever they believed came after it. Lions carved in relief appear at several tomb entrances, functioning as guardians in a tradition that echoes across thousands of miles and entirely separate cultural lines, the sentinel figures of San Agustín. What makes Dadan particularly compelling from a historical perspective is its cosmopolitan character. The inscriptions found at the site are not all in Dadanite script. There are texts in Minaic, the language of a South Arabian trading kingdom. There are references to individuals from different regional backgrounds, merchants, priests, envoys, who passed through, settled temporarily, or made dedications at the local temples. Dadan was not an isolated community. It was a node in a network, and the diversity of its textual record reflects the diversity of the world it was connected to. That world connection is also why its disappearance from popular historical consciousness is somewhat puzzling. The Greeks knew of the region. The Hebrew Bible references a place called Dadan, believed by many scholars to correspond to this same valley in contexts that suggest it was recognized as a place of significant trade and cultural presence. Yet for centuries, the broader historical narrative of the ancient Near East moved on without fully accounting for what had flourished here. Recent years have changed that. Systematic archaeological work in the Al-Ula Valley, supported by Saudi and international research partnerships, has begun to fill in the picture with a level of detail that earlier generations of scholars could only approximate. Each season of excavation produces new inscriptions, new structural evidence, new corrections to the timeline. The valley kept its secrets well, but the rock remembers everything written on it, and there is a great deal written here. The rock faces of the Dadan Valley hold their inscriptions with a permanence that time has so far respected. Names and dedications pressed into stone by people who understood that the desert preserves what other climates destroy. That same quality of preservation, that same alliance between arid air and ancient ambition, draws us now further south and west, across the Red Sea and deep into northeastern Africa, where a civilization built its own monuments to permanence in a form that the modern world has spent 2 centuries misreading. Most people, asked to picture ancient pyramids, place them instinctively in Egypt. The image is fixed. The 3 great structures at Giza, broad and massive against a pale sky. Their proportions so familiar, they have become almost symbolic rather than architectural. What far fewer people picture are the Pyramids of Sudan. And yet, there are more of them, significantly more. The ancient kingdom of Kush, which ruled from its heartland along the Nile in what is now northern Sudan, built over 250 pyramids across several royal burial sites, nearly twice the number constructed in Egypt over the entire span of pharaonic history. The most significant concentration stands at Meroe, a site on the east bank of the Nile, roughly 3 hours north of Khartoum by road. Here, across a stretch of desert interrupted only by the occasional acacia tree and the slow curve of the river in the distance, more than 200 pyramids rise from the sand in clusters that correspond to different periods of the Meroitic kingdom, which flourished from roughly 300 BCE until around 350 CE. The structures are steep, far steeper than their Egyptian counterparts, with angles that approach 65 to 70 degrees compared to the roughly 51 degrees of the Great Pyramid at Giza. They are also smaller in footprint, typically ranging from 20 to 90 feet at the base, giving them a narrow, almost needle-like profile against the horizon that is immediately distinct from anything in Egypt. That distinction is important because the relationship between Kush and Egypt was never one of simple imitation. The two civilizations spent centuries in contact, sometimes as trading partners, sometimes as rivals, and for a remarkable period in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE as political unities, when Kushite kings from the dynasty known as the 25th conquered Egypt and ruled it as pharaohs. Those kings built pyramids in their homeland as royal burial monuments, drawing on Egyptian tradition while adapting it to their own aesthetic and theological sensibilities. The steep pitch, the small funerary chapels attached to the eastern faces of the pyramids, the specific iconographic programs carved into the chapel walls. These are not Egyptian copies. They are Kushite statements, made in a form borrowed from the north and transformed into something distinctly their own. The chapels are where much of the surviving visual and textual evidence concentrates. Carved reliefs depict the deceased ruler being presented before the gods, particularly Osiris and the lion-headed Apidamak, a distinctly Kushite deity who appears nowhere in the Egyptian pantheon. Meroitic script, a writing system still only partially deciphered, covers some of the inscribed surfaces, a reminder that this was a literate culture conducting its religious and administrative life in its own language, not a borrowed one. The physical condition of the Meroe pyramids today reflects a particular chapter of 19th century history that the site carries like a scar. In the 1830s, an Italian treasure hunter named Giuseppe Fellini systematically demolished the upper sections of roughly 40 pyramids in his search for buried gold. He found one significant cache of jewelry in a single pyramid, almost certainly placed there by chance rather than as a general practice, and destroyed dozens of irreplaceable structures in the process. The jagged, broken tops, visible on many of the pyramids at Meroe, are his legacy, and they stand as a sobering reminder of how much the historical record can be damaged by a single season of unchecked extraction. Despite that damage, what remains is genuinely staggering in its cumulative effect. Walking the site in the early morning, before the heat builds, with the pyramids casting long shadows eastward across the sand and the Nile glinting somewhere beyond the low hills, the scale of Kushite royal ambition becomes fully legible. This was a kingdom that endured for over 1,000 years, that built cities, conducted international trade, produced sophisticated metallurgy, and buried its rulers under monuments that are still standing in the desert, patient and steep, and largely unvisited, waiting for the world to look properly in their direction. The pyramids of Meroe rise from the Sudanese desert with a solitary confidence. Monuments built for eternity in a landscape that seems designed to enforce it. We carry that sense of deep time with us now as we move northeast, back across the Red Sea and onto the Arabian Peninsula, where the eastern coastline tells a very different kind of ancient story. not one of royal burial and monumental architecture, but one of trade, water, and the kind of continuous human settlement that accumulates layers the way a shoreline accumulates sand, slowly, quietly, and to remarkable depth. Al-Qatif sits on the coast of what is now the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, facing the Persian Gulf across a stretch of shallow, warm water that has been one of the most commercially active bodies of water in the ancient world for at least 5,000 years. The Gulf connected Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley civilizations of modern Pakistan and India, and the ports along its western shore served as waypoints, supply depots, and trading hubs for a maritime network that moved copper, textiles, grain, and luxury goods across distances that still impress when you trace them on a map. Al-Qatif was one of those waypoints, and one of the most enduring. Archaeological evidence places human settlement in this area as far back as the 3rd millennium BCE, making it contemporary with the early cities of Mesopotamia and the Bronze Age cultures of the Gulf. The region was known in ancient sources by various names across different periods: Gera, Hajar, and later references in Islamic geographical literature confirm that this particular stretch of coastline was never truly abandoned, never fully eclipsed, through the long succession of empires and trading systems that rose and fell around it. What draws archaeologists and historians to Al-Qatif specifically is the evidence of that continuity. The ancient foundations discovered beneath and around the modern city represent occupation layers that span from the Bronze Age through the Dilmun civilization, a Gulf culture centered on the island of Bahrain, but with significant mainland presence, through Parthian and Sasanian Persian influence, into the early Islamic period and beyond. Each layer is a chapter, and the chapters stack in a sequence that reflects the changing political and commercial geography of the ancient Near East with unusual completeness. The Dilmun connection is particularly significant. Dilmun appears in some of the oldest written records known to archaeology. Sumerian texts from the 3rd millennium BCE describe it as a sacred, pure land, a place associated with origins and divine favor. Later texts make clear it was also a thoroughly practical commercial reality, exporting dates, copper, and other goods into the Mesopotamian market system. The eastern coast of Arabia, including the Al-Qatif region, formed part of Dilmun's mainland territory, and the material culture recovered from this area, including distinctive Dilmun stamp seals, pottery styles, and burial practices, connects it firmly to that wider Gulf trading world. Water made all of this possible in a way that is easy to underestimate from a modern perspective. The Al-Qatif oasis, fed by artesian springs that push fresh water to the surface in the midst of an otherwise arid coastal environment, supported agricultural production, particularly date palms, that could sustain a population large enough to participate meaningfully in regional trade. Dates were not merely food. They were a storable, transportable caloric resource that functioned almost as currency in the ancient Gulf economy. A settlement with reliable date production and a coastline accessible to Gulf shipping was, in the ancient world, a settlement with structural advantages that compounded over centuries. The physical remains visible today are fragmentary in the way that continuously inhabited sites always are. Each generation of builders repurposing the materials of the last, erasing foundations as they lay new ones, leaving an archaeological record that requires careful excavation to read. The old town of Al-Qatif, portions of which survived into the 20th century before rapid modernization altered the urban fabric substantially, still shows traces of its layered past in the arrangement of neighborhoods, the alignment of old streets, and the occasional exposed stonework that surfaces when construction disturbs the ground beneath the modern city. What Al-Qatif represents, in the broadest sense, is the quiet power of geographic advantage sustained across millennia. The springs did not move, the coastline did not close, and so the settlement persisted, through the Bronze Age, through Persian dominion, through the rise of Islam, through the Ottoman period, and into the present, accumulating history the way all truly old places do, one generation at a time, each one building on the foundations of the last, without always knowing exactly what lay beneath. The layered foundations of Al-Qatif speak to a different kind of ancient ambition, not the vertical ambition of pyramids or carved cliff shrines, but the horizontal ambition of communities determined to hold their ground across centuries of shifting political fortune. That instinct to define and defend a boundary, to draw a line between what is ours and what lies beyond, is as old as settled life itself, and nowhere does it express itself more plainly than in the walls that ancient builders raised across the desert landscapes of Arabia, structures that time has worn down, but not entirely erased, still visible in the terrain, like old sentences, partially rubbed from a page. Desert walls are easy to underestimate. They do not soar. They do not carry the visual drama of cliff-carved shrines or steep-sided pyramids. They run horizontally across the land, following ridgelines, skirting wadis, connecting natural features into a continuous defensive perimeter that made geographic sense in its time and can still be traced on the ground and from the air today. In the Arabian Peninsula, these ancient ramparts appear across a wide geographic range. In the Hejaz, in the Nejd, along the edges of oasis settlements, and between agricultural zones and the open desert beyond. Their origins are varied. Some of the oldest wall systems in the region date to the pre-Islamic period, constructed by communities whose names and political structures survive only in fragmentary inscriptions and the occasional reference in classical sources. Others were built or substantially extended during the early Islamic centuries, when the rapid expansion of the new faith and the political order it carried with it created both new territorial boundaries and new reasons to defend existing ones. The walls served different purposes in different contexts, sometimes purely military, designed to slow or channel an approaching force, sometimes administrative, marking the edge of cultivated land and establishing who owed taxes on what, sometimes symbolic, asserting the claim of a settled community against the open desert and the pastoral populations that moved through it. The construction methods varied with the available materials. In areas where sandstone was accessible, walls were built from rough-cut blocks laid in courses with minimal mortar, relying on mass and careful placement for stability. In regions where stone was scarce, builders used mud brick, less durable, more vulnerable to rain and flash flooding, but enormously practical in an environment where the raw material was literally underfoot. Some wall systems combined both, using stone for the lower courses, where moisture from the ground posed the greatest threat, and mud brick for the upper sections, where speed of construction mattered more than longevity. What survives today varies enormously by location and construction method. The stone walls have held their form with reasonable fidelity in areas where the climate has been dry and the human pressure for reuse of building material has been limited. The mud brick sections have fared less well, reduced in many places to low earthen ridges that are identifiable as walls only to a practiced eye. their height collapsed inward over centuries of neglect. Aerial photography and satellite imagery have transformed the study of these structures in recent decades, allowing researchers to trace wall alignments across distances that would take weeks to walk, identifying systems of defensive architecture that were simply invisible at ground level. One of the more striking aspects of these wall systems is what they reveal about ancient population geography. A wall is only built where there is something worth protecting, and the locations of ancient Arabian ramparts consistently correspond to areas of agricultural productivity, reliable water sources, or commercially significant route corridors. Mapping the walls is, in a real sense, mapping the ancient landscape of valued space, tracing the boundaries that communities drew around the resources that kept them alive. The human cost of maintaining these structures should not pass without acknowledgement either. Building a wall across miles of difficult desert terrain, then garrisoning and repairing it across generations, required a sustained organizational commitment that placed real demands on the populations involved. The labor was not abstract, it was specific. Men cutting stone in the heat, hauling material up ridgelines, mixing and laying mud brick in summer temperatures that have not moderated since. The walls stand as evidence not just of political strategy, but of physical endurance, applied across lifetimes in service of a community's survival. They are quieter monuments than most, unheroic in their appearance, unglamorous in their function. But they mark the oldest edges of human ambition in this landscape. The line between here and out there, between safety and uncertainty, between the world a community had built and the open desert that was always waiting just beyond. Those ancient walls and ramparts drew the boundaries of survival across the open desert, lines of stone and mud brick that said, simply and firmly, this far and no further. The impulse behind them was defensive, protective, oriented outward toward threat. But as we move now into the Al-Ula Valley, just a short distance from the Dadan ruins we visited earlier in this journey, we encounter something that turns that impulse inward. A walled urban settlement that did not merely defend itself against the desert, but organized an entire community life within its boundaries, generation after generation, for roughly 1,000 years. The old town of Al-Ula occupies the floor of a narrow valley carved by ancient water action through the sandstone plateau of northwestern Saudi Arabia. The same cliffs that frame the Dadan ruins to the south also frame this settlement, and the relationship between the two sites is not coincidental. Al-Ula Valley has been a corridor of human movement and habitation for millennia. Its combination of underground water, fertile soil, and natural defensive topography, making it one of the most consistently occupied stretches of terrain in the entire Arabian Peninsula. The old town itself, distinct from the ancient Dadan and Lihianite remains nearby, was established sometime around the 12th century CE and was continuously inhabited until 1983, when its last residents relocated to the modern city that has grown up around it. That recent abandonment gives the site an unusual quality among the places we have visited on this journey. This is not a ruin that faded across millennia. It is a place that was alive within living memory, and the structures it contains reflect not prehistoric ambition, but the accumulated domestic and civic life of a medieval and early modern Arabian community. At its peak, the old town contained roughly 900 houses, stacked and connected in the dense, interlocking manner typical of traditional Arabian urban architecture. The buildings are constructed primarily from mud brick and stone, their walls sharing common surfaces with neighboring structures in a way that reduced the need for individual exterior walls and created a building mass so dense and interconnected that the town functioned almost as a single structure rather than a collection of separate buildings. Narrow lanes, some barely wide enough for two people to pass comfortably, wound between these blocks, shaded by the height of the buildings on either side and cooler by several degrees than the open valley floor beyond the town walls. At the center of the settlement stands a mosque that served the community across the full span of its occupation, rebuilt and modified in successive generations, but maintaining its position as the physical and spiritual anchor of the town's layout. Around it, the residential quarters organized themselves according to family and clan affiliations in patterns that were understood implicitly by the residents even when they were not marked explicitly in the architecture. The social geography of the town was embedded in its physical geography, a relationship that is common to traditional urban settlements across the Islamic world, but is particularly legible here because the abandonment was so recent and so complete. That completeness of abandonment is, paradoxically, what has preserved the old town as well as it has. When the residents left in 1983, they did not dismantle their homes for materials, as often happens when settlements are gradually depopulated over time. They left largely intact. The result is a ghost town in the most literal sense. Structures standing to their full height in many areas, doorways still framed, rooms still defined, the spatial logic of a living community frozen at the moment of its departure. The decay since then has been significant. Mud brick exposed to occasional rain and the thermal stress of desert temperature swings deteriorates steadily without maintenance, and portions of the old town have collapsed into themselves, the upper stories folding down onto the lower ones in slow stages. Conservation efforts in recent years, as part of the broader development of Al-Ula as a heritage destination, have worked to stabilize the most vulnerable structures and document what remains before further loss occurs. Walking through the old town today, through those narrow shaded lanes with the sandstone cliffs rising behind the roofline and the silence pressing in from all sides, the 1,000 years of continuous habitation become tangible in a way that purely ancient sites rarely manage. The doorway you pass through was built for someone who woke up in the same room every morning, who knew every neighbor, who understood this dense, intricate place as simply home. The desert waited outside the walls, then, just as it waits now. But inside, for 1,000 years, there was a city. The old town of Al-Ula reminds us that abandonment is not always the end of a story. Sometimes it is simply a pause, a held breath, a moment when the human noise stops and the structure speaks for itself. We carry that thought eastward now, across the Hejaz Mountains and down onto the broad, flat expanse of the Najd Plateau, where the capital of modern Saudi Arabia rises from a landscape that was, not so very long ago, the stage for one of the most consequential political transformations in Arabian history. On the northwestern edge of Riyadh, where the Wadi Hanifa cuts a green corridor through the plateau, the ruins of Diriyah's Turaif district stand as the physical remains of the moment when a small oasis settlement became the seat of an empire. Diriyah was founded in the 15th century CE, established by the ancestral clan of the Al Saud family in a location that combined the defensive advantages of the Wadi's steep banks with access to the agricultural productivity of its floor. For 2 centuries, it was a regional settlement of modest significance, prosperous enough, stable enough, but not yet the center of anything beyond its immediate hinterland. That changed in 1744, when a meeting took place within its walls that altered the trajectory of Arabian history in ways still felt today. In that year, Muhammad ibn Saud, the ruler of Diriyah, formed an alliance with Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, a religious scholar who had developed a reformist interpretation of Islamic practice that emphasized a return to what he understood as the foundational principles of the faith. The political and the theological joined hands in Diriyah, and the partnership between the Al Saud family and the religious reform movement that emerged from that agreement became the ideological engine of a rapid territorial expansion. Within decades, the first Saudi state controlled much of the Arabian Peninsula, and Diriyah was its capital. The Turaif district was the heart of that capital, the royal and administrative quarter built on a promontory above the wadi, where the plateau edge drops away sharply, giving the site both natural defensibility and a commanding view of the valley below. The architecture of Turaif is Najdi mud brick at its most ambitious, thick-walled structures with the characteristic triangular crenellations along their parapets, decorative geometric patterns pressed into plaster surfaces, and the specific spatial organization of traditional Najdi domestic and civic architecture. Courtyards surrounded by rooms of specific and understood function, reception areas separated from private quarters by deliberate architectural sequences. The scale of what was built here during the late 18th and early 19th centuries reflects the resources flowing into Diriyah at the height of Saudi power. Palaces for senior members of the ruling family, a mosque complex that served both the resident population and visiting dignitaries, administrative buildings, storage facilities, and the dense residential quarters of the court community. All of it constructed in mud brick. All of it organized across the promontory in a layout that was both practically efficient and symbolically legible. The height of the buildings, the elaboration of the decorative programs, the size of the reception halls, these were statements of authority, communicated in the architectural language of the Nejd. That authority came to an abrupt and violent end in 1818, when an Ottoman military expedition, commanded by Ibrahim Pasha, captured Diriyah after a prolonged siege, demolished significant portions of the Turaif district, and effectively dismantled the first Saudi state. The campaign was thorough and deliberately destructive. The Ottomans understood that the physical capital of a political movement carried symbolic weight, and they acted accordingly. What they left behind was a ruin, and a ruin it remained for nearly 2 centuries. The rehabilitation of Diriyah as a heritage site in the 21st century has been one of the most ambitious historic preservation projects undertaken in the Arabian Peninsula. Turaif was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2010, and subsequent years have brought systematic conservation, archaeological documentation, and the careful stabilization of surviving structures. The mud brick walls that remain standing have been reinforced and protected against further weathering. The spatial logic of the district has been made legible again for visitors who walk through it today. What strikes most forcefully in Turaif is not the scale of the ruins, but the intimacy of the architecture. The human proportions of doorways, the domestic quality of courtyard spaces, the sense that power in this place was exercised not from a distant palace, but from rooms that were, by any measure, modest in their physical dimensions. The first Saudi state changed the map of Arabia from buildings that would not look out of place in any traditional Nejdi village. That combination of historical consequence and architectural humility gives Diriyah its particular and lasting resonance. The mud brick walls of Diriyah carry the weight of a political transformation that reshaped an entire peninsula. Power exercised from modest rooms, consequence built from humble materials. From that plateau, in the heart of Arabia, we now make one of the longest geographic leaps of this journey, crossing oceans and continents to arrive in the foothills of the Bolivian Andes, where a sandstone outcrop rising from the surrounding forest holds what may be the largest carved rock in the world. The scale shifts, the hemisphere shifts, but the human impulse behind what we find here, to impose meaning on stone, to make a landscape speak the language of belief and authority, remains exactly the same. El Fuerte de Samaipata sits at roughly 6,000 feet above sea level in the Bolivian department of Santa Cruz, on the eastern slopes of the Andes, where the mountains begin their long descent toward the Amazon basin. The terrain here is greener and warmer than the high Andean Altiplano further west, a transitional zone between mountain and lowland that has historically made it a place of contact between different ecological zones and the cultures that developed within them. The name Samaipata comes from the Quechua words for rest and highlands, a resting place in the heights, and the site does carry a quality of deliberate pause, of a place chosen for reasons that go beyond the merely practical. The centerpiece of the site is a sandstone hill, roughly 220 meters long and 60 meters wide, whose upper surface has been carved so extensively and so intricately that it is difficult, standing on it, to find a section that has not been shaped by human hands. Channels, niches, geometric forms, zoomorphic figures, particularly felines and serpents, ceremonial seats, and what appear to be conduit systems for liquid flow are cut into the rock surface across its full extent. The carving is not the work of a single period or a single culture. It accumulated over centuries, with different hands and different intentions leaving their marks in successive layers on the same stone canvas. The earliest significant occupation of the site is associated with a pre-Inca culture whose identity remains debated among archaeologists. By the 15th century, the Inca Empire had incorporated Samaipata into its expanding eastern frontier, and the Inca contribution to the rock's carved surface is substantial. The characteristic geometric precision of Inca stonework is visible in sections of the carving that differ stylistically from the earlier work beneath and around them. Samaipata represented one of the easternmost points of Inca territorial reach, a frontier outpost at the edge of the empire's ability to project control into the lowlands beyond. The carved rock functioned as a ceremonial center. That much is broadly agreed. The specific rituals conducted there are less clear, though the recurring imagery of felines and serpents, both animals of enormous symbolic importance across Andean cosmologies, suggests a site oriented toward the kind of cosmic mediation that Andean religious practice consistently associated with elevated liminal spaces. The hilltop position, the carved seats that may have served as thrones or ritual stations, the channels that may have directed chicha, fermented maize beer used in Andean ceremony, across the rock surface during ritual events, all of these point toward a place where the boundary between the human community and the forces that governed its world was understood to be unusually thin. Below the carved rock, archaeological excavation has revealed the remains of a substantial settlement, storage facilities, residential structures, and administrative buildings consistent with an Inca provincial installation. The combination of ceremonial and administrative functions at a single site is characteristic of how the Inca Empire organized its frontier territories, using religious authority and practical administration as mutually reinforcing instruments of control. The rock above legitimized the state below, and the state below maintained and elaborated the rock above. Spanish colonial forces occupied and modified the site in the 16th century, adding their own structures to the complex in a pattern of layered occupation familiar from so many of the places we have visited. A UNESCO World Heritage designation in 1998 formalized international recognition of the site's significance, though El Fuerte remains considerably less visited than its importance warrants. The carved rock itself, seen in the slanted light of late afternoon when the shadows pool in the channels and the feline forms seem almost to shift against the stone, communicates something that resists neat archaeological categorization. This was not merely a political installation or a religious site in any narrow sense. It was a place where a community came to locate itself in the universe, to find, in carved stone, an elevated ground and the view across the descending forest toward the distant lowlands, its own position in a world that was very much larger than itself. The carved summit of Samaipata draws the eye outward, toward the descending forest, toward the lowland horizon, toward a world the Inca Empire was pressing against, but never fully absorbed. We descend now from that eastern frontier and move deeper into the Andes, traveling south and west along the mountain spine of South America to the high valley basin near Cusco, Peru, where a civilization that predated the Inca by 4 centuries left behind one of the most formally planned urban complexes in the pre-Columbian world. Where Samaipata speaks in curves and carved organic forms, what awaits us here speaks in straight lines, relentless, deliberate, and geometrically uncompromising in a way that still commands attention from the air. Pikillaqta sits in the Luca Basin, roughly 30 kilometers southeast of Cusco, at an elevation just above 11,000 feet. The name means flea town in Quechua, a label applied by later populations who had no memory of who built it or why. A small linguistic reminder that even imposing ruins can accumulate dismissive nicknames when their builders have been forgotten. The people who actually constructed Pikillaqta were the Wari, an Andean civilization that emerged in the Ayacucho region of south-central Peru around 600 CE and expanded across a vast territory during the Middle Horizon period, roughly 600 to 1000 CE, creating what many archaeologists consider the first true empire in Andean history, preceding the Inca by several centuries, and in some respects anticipating the administrative strategies the Inca would later deploy with such dramatic effect. The site covers roughly 2 square kilometers, enclosed within a perimeter wall that still stands to significant height in several sections. Inside that boundary, the urban grid is laid out with a regularity that is immediately apparent and somewhat startling, given the mountainous terrain. Streets run at right angles. Compounds are arranged in repeating units of nearly identical size and configuration. The standardization is so consistent across the site that it clearly reflects centralized planning executed according to a predetermined template rather than the organic growth of a community developing incrementally over time. Someone designed Pikillaqta whole, or very nearly so, before construction began. The individual compounds within the grid are large, some covering areas equivalent to a city block, and their internal arrangements follow a pattern of rooms organized around central courtyards that appears repeatedly across Wari sites throughout their imperial territory. Archaeologists have identified this compound type as a characteristic Wari administrative unit, a physical expression of the empire's approach to organizing the populations and resources of the territories it incorporated. The rooms within the compounds were not domestic spaces in any ordinary sense. The doorways are narrow to the point of being deliberately restrictive, and the interior spaces show little evidence of the kind of hearths, storage patterns, and material culture associated with everyday residential life. What the compounds do show is evidence of large-scale feasting and the production and consumption of chicha on a significant scale. Ceramic remains consistent with both brewing and communal drinking have been found throughout the site. In Andean political culture, the obligation of a ruler or administrative authority to provide food and drink to those who worked within the imperial system was fundamental. Feasting was not celebration in a casual sense. It was statecraft, the mechanism by which labor obligations were acknowledged, alliances maintained, and the social contract between the empire and its subject populations renewed in physical, embodied terms. Pikillaqta was, among other things, a machine for that kind of political hospitality, operating at imperial scale. The site was apparently never fully completed. Sections of the perimeter wall and several interior compounds show evidence of construction halted before finishing, and there are areas where planned structures were begun, but not brought to completion before the Wari withdrawal from the Cusco region, which appears to have occurred sometime around 900 CE. The reasons for that withdrawal, whether military pressure, internal political collapse, environmental stress, or some combination, remain a subject of active scholarly debate. What is clear is that Pikillaqta was deliberately decommissioned rather than simply abandoned. Evidence suggests that the Wari sealed doorways, buried ritual deposits, and systematically closed the site before departing, a process that implies intention and organization rather than sudden flight. The Inca, who arrived in the Cusco Valley centuries later and built their own empire in the same landscape, were certainly aware of Pikillaqta. They modified portions of the site and incorporated it into their own sacred geography, treating the massive abandoned compound as a huaca, a place of spiritual power, in the way Andean cultures consistently approached the imposing remains of their predecessors. The grid still reads clearly from above, its straight lines cutting across the Luca Basin with the quiet authority of a plan that time has roughed up but not erased. Every place we have visited on this journey began as someone's answer to a question. How do we honor our dead, defend our homes, mark our territory, reach toward the divine, or simply declare that we were here? The stones at Gunung Kawi, the basalt columns of the Irish coast, the faceless guardians of San Agustín, the inscribed cliffs of Dadan, the steep pyramids of Sudan, the layered foundations of Qatif, the desert ramparts, the ghost lanes of Al-Ula, the mud-brick courts of Diriyah, the carved summit of Samaipata, the geometric grid of Pikillaqta. Each one is a different answer, shaped by a different culture, a different landscape, a different understanding of what it means to be human in a world that does not automatically make room for us. What connects them is not age or geography or architectural style. What connects them is the refusal to disappear without leaving something behind. That refusal is one of the most consistent things our species has ever done, across every continent and every era for which we have evidence. We build, we carve, we mark, we remember. The world is full of places like these, quieter than the famous sites, less visited, less explained, but no less meaningful for any of that. They are waiting, most of them, for someone to simply show up and pay attention. If this journey gave you something, a place you want to learn more about, a civilization you had never considered before, a moment of genuine surprise, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. If you want to keep exploring, subscribe and stay with us. There are many more stones that remember, and we are just getting started.